صباح الخير الجميع. Welcome to Psychic Militancy. My name is Lara, and I'm so excited to have my comrades Amin and Nitasha here with me. Before we get started, you know the drill, folks. Make this content keep going. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our Patreon. Share it with a friend. Do all the shit. Fuck with YouTube. We need to get through their algorithms, their oppressive algorithms. And you all can help us do that. So make sure you go ahead and do that. And I just want to also just say thank you for all your support. That we've been having such a great time having awesome comrades. And today is no different. These two people are some of my favorites. I haven't seen them in such a long time. I'm so excited you get to know them. Some of you might already know that they were involved with Decolonize This Place. I just want to say that artwork right behind me, folks, every single time you see me is from them, right? So I have so much of my artwork is because of them. This is an old school sticker, right? Turns out for her it was a metaphor, but like still, right? So cool, right? They've been awesome. They've been on it for decades. They've been doing the fucking work. You know, you both are so near and dear to my heart, and I will never forget the organizing, the incredible labor you all were putting together. Just to sort of frame for folks, so these two people you see right here are folks who've been committed to the struggle, certainly for the liberation of Palestine, but also, abolition work, working against the violent police violence, particularly in New York, and everything else you might imagine that led us to this moment. So you see the fascist moment now, and these folks in front of you are folks who have been sort of looking at this, studying it, incredible teachers, wonderful humans. This is one of the things that I love about this show is I get to invite the wonderful humans I have learned so much from, and that means so much to me and the way that sort of my orientation to the world and organizing. These are two of them. And so I just want to start off there. First of all, how are you? How are things? We'll start there, and then maybe we can get into, I had said to you all before that when we see people seize the moment, particularly in New York around the last, leading up to 3 years now, we should be so proud of everything on the ground and the mobilization. For those of us who have been part of the struggle for a long time, for me, when I look at New York scene, I can't but think of Decolonize This Place and all the things that you all were doing. We're shutting down museums, fuck the police, subway fares, coming up against all this sort of shit is like builds an infrastructure that people then can see. So I would love to hear about that. But I'm going to shut my mouth now and turn it over to you all and see, how are you? How have you been? Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Lara, for having us. Those are such kind words. And we're really excited to be with you and to invite us and to share some of the history and the context in which we're also struggling with as well. But because we'll be saying things, that kind of go back in time, it'll seem like a lot of also failures. And I think just to remember these, failure, it's also how we measure and recognize and what we value. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that even though it may seem like this is like, where's the hope? The hope is from knowing, from recognizing, from finding each other. So yeah, that's kind of the background. I'm in New York City right now. I've managed to visit friends in Europe who are also doing organizing. So we also have a sense of what's happening in other continents, and been to Palestine in the genocide twice in the West Bank. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm showing up with today.
I'm so glad to have you. And we can get into the so-called failure, sort of pessimistic, I think we all work against that, but I'm glad you just kind of immediately framed it like that. Nitasha, hi.
Hi, thank you for having us, and it's so nice to see you. It feels like it's been a long time, but also like such a short time, because it's just so crazy. Like everything that's been going on is absolutely insane. We're happy to be here and talk about our experiences. I think, as Amin said, that one of the things that we've always talked about is like movements keep moving and walking we ask questions. So I think we're also very happy to be here to reflect with you, because things have massively changed, right? We started Decolonize This Place in 2016, and we're almost a decade later now, which is 2026 now. And before Decolonize This Place, there was Occupy, and before Occupy there was Seattle, and also there was the Arab uprisings, which deeply impacted what was happening in the region. And so I think we're also really happy to be here and reflect with you, as to how we can move forward even in such conditions of despair. And people always ask this question, like, where's the hope, which is like always a weird question in my mind, because things are so fucking screwed. So you're like, like, what do you mean by where's the hope? But I do think that we can rephrase that question, right? And like really think about, like, okay, where do we put our energies? Like that's where I'm thinking, like, what do we actually give our life to? No, like, where do we actually think that there is a possibility of anything shifting? So I think that's the place we're also at, like, because also after Decolonize This Place, we did other things like Strike MoMA, and then of course there was, there's the genocide, which is still ongoing, and that has resulted in, I mean, yeah, there are failures, because the genocide hasn't stopped, but also it's also like, as Amin was talking, we met people in Europe. There's also this idea of like, okay, it did something, right? Like a lot of mobilization, a lot of people came together, and that overall this what Palestine means today is not the same. And like, so where do we go from there? Because in some ways I think, and I think especially people who work around Palestine, like Palestine is the core right now. If we ignore it as just one other struggle, I think that would be a big mistake, because it's really showing the world what the future looks like. We talk about this idea of Palestine being everywhere, and that Palestine is our future. And we've been saying that for a long time, in the sense that we can learn a lot from Palestine. We can also learn a lot from New York. They're almost two ends of a spectrum, right? This hyper capitalist place, and this like completely militarized, occupied. I mean, I don't even know if we can call it an occupation anymore. Like, don't even know if we, even the terminology is completely failing us. So yeah, so just that we're very excited to be here and to think with you, and it's nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. I mean, that you already are bringing us into the realm, like it's been a decade, and to really think how much has changed. And truly, like, cataclysmically on some level, and then also infrastructurally in such important ways globally, with the uprisings we're seeing, with people connecting the dots, kind of the fruits of a lot of the labor that you all were sort of laying down with comrades. But maybe just for folks that don't know, can you all give a sense of what Decolonize This Place is, like the shit you all were doing, right? Like, I don't get to have artwork like this without you all doing the real shit, rallying people, intervening on the community level. I know this stuff, but I'd love more folks to know, especially since it's been a decade. I mean, this is the way that shit moves. Sometimes it moves so quickly. And I think for me, one of the things that a Colonial Logics does is also atomize movement. So it seems like every movement is a silo by itself and intimidates people, rather than a working on or building upon the things that came before. Not necessarily, but like that had to be there as a bedrock for the next thing to come into being. So that's also part of the reason why I wanted you all to kind of give that a little bit of that history.
Yeah. So the thing about Decolonize This Place, to understand it, you understand it beginning kind of with a set of experiences that we had from Occupy Wall Street. We were core organizers in Occupy Wall Street. What did we learn in Occupy Wall Street? Direct action is important. Organizing, taking up physical space. Physical space is important because that's where people gather, and where people can have conversations with each other that aren't mediated when we don't have language and the language was failing us. People reproduced society in a park that made the state irrelevant. This was powerful. And it wasn't that there wasn't demands. The demands were endless, But also the demands on the state meant that if they're not responding to them, people act. This wasn't based on identities. People showed up because their problem was the system, and their response was to step out of it. That was our entry point into organizing in the city, but its limitations were several. One, it didn't recognize we're on stolen land. It didn't recognize that this city was, for New York, it was built by migrants. It was built by, enslaved labor. These are debts that we owe each other. These kind of things meant that the movement could be co-opted by the state, and it got taken in with the Bernie Sanders movement, which we still see it today. So that was kind of our thing. So then we also recognize something really important that's coming up right now, which is the state sends the police, because then the media always reports police and protesters. Never the issue, never the subject matter, because they don't want our voices or our thoughts or our experiences to be traveling mainstream. That's what led us also to kind of working on museums. Not as museums, oh, the art matters, or the art doesn't matter, either way. It was more of like, let's go to sites of injustice, where the rich, wealthy are there, and we know that they're part of something, and they're using aesthetics to keep us oppressed. And connect struggles from a site where all our struggles intersect: labor, gender, capital, right? Because, so from that experience, but also to activate a buffer between the police and the people that are taking action. Because when you're inside of an institution, it's very different than when you're on a street. The institution has to call the police. When the institution calls the police, then they have a problem with their reputation. You're creating a dilemma decision for them. And you're also positioning yourself to point to something in the world that everyone has a relation to. That creates a situation. We can also take action, right? And in that action creates its own media and gathering for sites of transformation. So we took that with us. And at the same time in 2014, the Gaza war occurred, right? On the war on Gaza in 2014, which we organized for under Direct Action Front for Palestine. And we're involved in all the solidarity work with the Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives and Black liberation. One of the things in 2014 that was really clear is that you can't keep going from one issue to another. You need to have some structural analysis of the situation, of how a coalition of those trying to get free beyond the nation state can come together on their same terms, on their terms, and both resist and build. Duality of power. And that's where I think brought us to this moment around Decolonize This Place. Nit.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that we learned through this time was also that how most of the movements actually organize around this idea of the nation state. How they organize within the idea of the nation state. So even Occupy or Black Lives Matter, or even the response towards Palestine, all of them were more in the context of what United States means as a country, and not just as not really as an empire. So I think all of that was part of it. So we started thinking about what does transnational solidarity mean then? How do we actually think about how to connect these different struggles? And so when we did Decolonize This Place, we organized it around 6 strands. So we said we start with indigenous sovereignty because you're on stolen land, because it was very specific to New York, Black liberation, free Palestine, global wage workers, degentrification, and dismantling patriarchy. And so it was really a structural response to settler colonialism rather than being in issue silos, because that was one of the things that we saw, that most of the movements are much more oriented towards their own silos. And so what happens is, this is like classic colonialism 101, right? They're able to divide and rule. We know this from the British Empire. So that was something I think that we kind of worked towards with Decolonize This Place. But one of the biggest things that came out of that was when we organize, we can't think of our movements in the context of just nation states. And like, kind of moving from that, reactionary organizing versus visionary organizing. Also not just pain-driven methods, but actually desire-driven, because this is something that is also that kind of comes into it. I just have to do something very quickly. I'm listening.
Take your time. Yeah, I think this is really important, because I think you can see the ways in which even organizing can there's a capture that happens. And I think, this is not to, I know you folks enough to know this is not to shame folks, it's to say, to track the ways in which our movements get captured by one thing, and that systems rely on our learned lack of imagination about what we can actually cut through. And part of, I think, what was so moving about your Decolonize This Place movement was that you understood that all of those points actually cuts across. You didn't have to do very much to be like, this cuts across all movements. We can actually become a place in which we then, whatever is more salient, of course, is something to be said. But fundamentally, you were focused on antagonizing the contradictions that emerged from those points, right? And those were kind of like let's say, the umbrella terms that, if we sort of step back, cut across all these structures. So the issues we were seeing and the failures of other movements actually were captured by these points that you all organized us around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think so. It's exactly right, in the sense that part of why these strands, and they're not demands, they're ways of orienting ourselves, because you act from a place, right? I am where I think and do. You're always being transformed, you're always being made. So then the question is, when you're fighting power, how can you both reject its legitimacy, right? And create a space that creates a different set of relationships. This is the important thing. So the strands became, think about it, you're organizing something around housing. Okay, but housing, but there's a person who owns a house and there's a person who rents. Those class dynamics are important, right? Thinking about these kind of, let's say, bringing the housing issue, not to take you out of it. Right? So let's give an example. How did Decolonize This Place begin? It began because we're also artists. It began by people saying, hey, we know you've been in a lot of movements. Do you want to do a show at Artist Space in New York? It's mad prestigious. We'll give you a space in Tribeca for 3 months, and we'll give you a budget. What do you want? We want an exhibit. We said, no, we won't exhibit things about the movement, things around representation, but we'll take the space, the physical space, and have an intention of a decolonial formation emerging from that space. Then we went and talked to people in different boroughs, and we said, if we had this physical space, how could it be useful for you? And we heard from everyone that because it's so central and each borough is in a place and they make it so hard for us to move from place to another, this is such a central location. So then we started talking to different groups in collectives around these strands, right? And then thought what they're working on and how that space can work for them. From movie nights that feed into these strands, so it's pedagogical, to production, to organizing and thinking about actions within this framework. It then produced a situation in which you can move in the city. That's why we were able to get 1,000 people out against the American Museum of Natural History. But what we did when we looked, for example, in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, these kind of 4 years, and we didn't call it a campaign because we worked on a lot of things. These are open files. We do not want to be separate. We want to come together. Palestine in this moment is essential because Palestine is bringing struggles together. So it's actually like a complementary moment for 2016. So we use the halls of the museum in which the colonizer says this is an African hall of people, African mammals, you know, I don't know what birds from Asia and this and that. Again, people in different halls. took the collectives and we went together and just like, you take this area, you take this area, how are you going to shape it, transform it, shut it down, create whatever? And it creates a schism even from the people who go to the museum who don't know how they're being indoctrinated into white supremacy, patriarchy, empire, which is the only, for example, site in New York in which every student is obligated to go there on Columbus Day. Fuck Columbus, right? So all of a sudden, you're not doing something specialized. We've never been for this idea of you're an organizer and you're an activist as if it's some kind of badge or some kind of title that you hold. We do work. You organize and you take action. All of us do it. The question is what are we doing it for? What are we valuing? And how are we oriented towards something else? And I think that we identified the strands. Then we identified the folks that we had a shared politics with, not agreements, shared politics. Because difference is powerful. Difference, if you can hold it in a coalition, becomes the death knell of the state. Because everything about the state is about inclusion and exclusion and who manages that line. And you could see, like, you could see in all these things that happen, they give you a little bit when there's, riots are about to take off. They give you a little bit. They take it back 2 years later when all the organizing is gone. Because they realize that all they have to do is take away your time, take away your physical space. That's infrastructure. Time, physical space.
I mean, also that these institutions are so much part of subject formation and how consciousness actually works. They're actually the core pillars of our society. And museums is just one example, but universities is also another. And there are many other institutions, swiping your subway card, for example, or even, anything that we do in society. Like one of the first things we're actually taught is how do you actually be a good citizen? So that's the starting point, right? And so just going off of the museum example with the American Museum of Natural History, it's a really wild space because it's the most funded museum in New York City, actually even in the United States, I think. And it actually had a statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside with an indigenous man and a black man as if they were going together on a mission. And Theodore Roosevelt is also the guy who came up with this idea of national parks, right? Because it was about conservation. Not mentioning that was actually a method to steal more indigenous land and actually to separate people from land, right? Which is the disaster that we're seeing today, right? And this is why Palestine is also really important, because it tells us that as long as we're connected to the land, it's a different story. But right now what we're seeing is, and I mean, this is why also I wanted to talk about this on this show, is because we're also seeing levels of mental health stuff, because people are actually not connected to land, which is what we're actually, meant to be in some ways. And so then you have an institution like American Museum of Natural History. We sat with their board members to talk about this and telling us that, well, actually our biggest focus right now is climate change, and it's not Asian halls and African halls and, all of these things, that as if climate change is not that, as if climate change is not looting of land that you still continue to do, and extraction of land, and it could look like real estate deals and gentrification in the city, but it could look like land grabs in Mexico or in Palestine or elsewhere, so that you can continue this way of living, right? You can continue this project of modernity. And if anybody is not for that, you lose your job, you lose your social media accounts, you're a threat to the model, and you really haven't really done anything, right? What have you done? And I think we've all kind of dealt with this at this point, right? So what happens, just by talking about Palestine, you become a threat to the institution, you get thrown out of the university, right? And so there's very specific I think what is also right now it's a very crucial moment for us to understand, especially in relation to technology. We're at a very pivotal moment where if we are not able to put another option in the world, right, this is the option and that's the status quo and you can't do anything. And everything in terms of counterinsurgency, which even means corporate capitalism, not just police and not just ICE and not just, the state, but everything around you works to tell you that this is the way you should be living. right? And that's the project of consciousness building. Like, you can see it. Like, if you're not for development, then you're an idiot, essentially, right? Because how are we going to live? Don't we need roads?
And you hate everybody, and you hate the poor aunties who like need, you know, new right new ways to make their bread that they've been making forever.
100%.
Right? No, no, I love that you're already there, and that's the point. I think normativity as the way that counterinsurgency embeds itself in everyday life and ideological processes. And I think, I mean, you had said like it's an orienting framework, like what Decolonize This Place gave the moment, the scene, the sort of coalition that you all were working with is an orienting framework. And I would say a counter orienting framework to what you all are saying, where you use the museum as an example. This is like a very Sarah Ahmed way of like how you're oriented to the entire space is built through these structures, normalized. It becomes normative way of viewing the world. And one of the things I found so wonderful and sort of moving about the work you all were doing is you were showing, this is why direct action, you were showing here are ways concretely that you can antagonize this, that you can disrupt this. And I think there's, you know, I've done a lot of work sort of thinking through about how folks sometimes think things have to be so big. And I'm not saying that your interventions were fucking big at some point, but this is a very like, you know, paging Fanon, because on this show we always do, right? It's that when things hit, this is paraphrasing him, nothing changes until it hits the core of colonialism. And I think one of the things you all were showing is in disrupting these spaces that had become concretized as normative spaces of being that only had one way to access them, which was to shore up and stabilize coloniality in general. Once you all disrupted that, shit came down hard. Like shit came down hard, and it came down swiftly. And this is the transformation of these. And I think these are the things that are always hidden in plain sight, how quickly the state and its organizations and its vessels can move when something actually antagonizes that normativity. And like, that's, you know, decolonize this space. It's like every space became a space for potential antagonism to unsettle, and I'm using that word on purpose, to unsettle the ways that things are meant to cohere and just kind of continue going as being.
100%. That in these moments of unsettling are where moments of transformation are possible. People always thought that, oh, well, here's direct action, and, you know, which I personally like, wonderful, but direct action, it teaches us, it transforms us. Your ability to say no, your ability to, with others, overcome fear. Fear of what? Fear of acting in an indeterminate direction. Because we're inclined for stability. We're inclined for knowing outcomes. Oh, I mean, the Lebanese government is telling this to the Lebanese people as they're selling them. If you don't like this, what option do you have? Dude, this is really important.
Which is a fucking lie.
It's a fucking lie. Because I don't need to say no to something I know is killing me. I don't need to know what the kind of replacement is. I need to just say no. That opens up a space. And this is, again, similar to the Zapatistas. It's like one no can open up a million yeses. So these direct actions against museums where people, first, there isn't a barricade separating people from others, right? So hard to kind of contain the troublemakers. But then a new constellation emerges in which they're agents and they're taking responsibility together to say no. This transformative space, then your body is telling you a lot of things that you already knew, right? You already knew in your body, this institution is oppressive. This institution is trying to tell me something that normalizes my erasure or the erasure of the people that I love. This institution, I mean, American Museum of Natural History is a backward place. But the one thing technological they do have has to do with the state of Israel and its creation. Everyone is in the past. Every people is in the fucking past. Except the people of Israel have always been.
Unbelievable.
But going there with your children, going there with your elders, going there without permission, this is really important. Permission. It's not that something needs to be legal or not. Fuck their legality. It's whether your act is transgressive, right? And so the navigation of these sites, again, from a strategic standpoint, this was about building power in sites and gathering in sites where you had an advantage, where pedagogy can happen, dead spaces can be made alive, aesthetics from a different orientation with a different purpose and a different horizon coming together on a smaller scale, but effective. Because when you shut down the Guggenheim, they're losing $100,000, $200,000. It's easy to shut down a Guggenheim. All you need to do is show up there 20 and start saying Palestine and not leave. So then these are strategic sites of engagement that could communicate more to the world that we're not alone. And that this idea of being overcoming helplessness requires each other acting together for something that we believe in. You cannot believe in the world that they're promising us right now, and you cannot compromise because they're giving us a world in which there is no ethics and no morality and no principles. You know?
Yeah. You see why I wanted them on psychic militancy, folks? That's right there. Exactly. It sort of gifts us that. Nitasha, did you want to say something? I saw you leaning into the space. No, I think this is so important because the foreclosure, you're basically talking about a foreclosure they're selling us. And what does it mean to engage in even what look like small acts of refusing the premise entirely? And then reconfiguring even what we are attuned to as a possibility in certain spaces, because that space, if you're thinking about a normative orientation, it already guides. I mean, their entire curate is about how guides you, how you move through a fucking museum. Like there's that is called carceral discipline. It's disciplining of bodies and the way you look at what you're supposed to look at, what you're not supposed to. You know, the Israelis being the people who have always been and will forever be, which is a really interesting take on settler futures. And that's the point, is how do you then infuse spaces with defiant antagonism, which to me is what Talfan al-Aqsa gifted us in a very similar type of space that was meant to confine movement, really orient people towards, again, not only their current day, but their future, what's to come. And I think this is part of what you're inviting, is like, can we always come in with the intention that perhaps merely being in a space differently can transform and create possibilities. Now, those possibilities, of course, now are matched with you all saying, here's the 6 strands that we're always thinking about. This is stolen land. This is about degentrification. This is about there's a framework with that people can sort of hold on to and maybe connect back to. But what will transform was never a given from what you all are saying.
Can you repeat that last point?
What was you didn't promise people what will be the transformation. Right. You were saying this act is actually really being in it together, ushering in something else was part of. I mean, that was for me what I connected to from organizing you all were doing.
Yeah,
this is. I mean, I'll just say something quickly. Like, I think this is the number that actually modernity plays on you, right? Like, it tells you time is linear. This is what progress and development looks like. Well, if you don't have a 5-year plan on what your life looks like, you're a failure, right? And so this is a huge thing because even the movement spaces then actually incorporate that. right? So when we say that it's in the act of coming together, this idea of like, when we were saying reactionary organizing versus visionary organizing, which is something that actually Grace Lee Boggs talks about, who was, in Detroit. And she also says this idea is like, what is, what was it? The clock on the world? What is
What
the
time
line?
is it on the clock of the world?
What time is it on the clock of the world, right? So I mean, I think I
I
think
think you
all
all
of
did
this,
a series about that, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
we did.
Online. Yeah,
We
I
did
remember
the
that.
time
you
is on the clock.
participated in it.
Yeah, that's
It was a
true.
conversation from Strike MoMA.
Yeah, because I think we've all been bought into this idea of like, if you know, that's the only way you can actually be on that path. If you don't know, it's unsafe, it's uncertain, and there is a huge level of fear that is then, inculcated in you, that there's no way for you to be able to even think of another option, right? And I mean, I think this is what also now our algorithmic lives are doing, right? Everything's on an algorithm, from like a grocery to cabs. So what is that? Really, it's breaking social relations, right? There is no other way to have social relations. It's very difficult for people to even be together in any way possible. So when Amin was talking about this idea of relationality, or when we were talking about these six strands are not just meant to be a laundry list. They're actually to think about how can they come together? How can they connect to each other? How can we actually create relations? Because it's really in the process that this will be figured out, right? I mean, even if you think about Palestine, people don't talk about, like, I mean, this idea of the one state and the two-state solution, that's something that's coming from like stupid states and like people in the West, right? Because they want to impose that. If you go to Palestine, people are just like, I just want to be fucking free. Like, I just want to be free, right? And what that means is very different from what it looks like as a nation state, or as, being handed over an institution that gives you pedagogy or aesthetics or whatever, right? Being free is a very different project, right? To then just exist or to live in any way. And and I think this is the part, like, based on what you were saying, is that it's inherently in the process. We don't know where we're going, right? We there's no way we can be like, oh, if you get onto this manifesto, you will be free. And I think that's the biggest lie actually that also exists in social movements a lot. Like, we actually have it in political organizing, especially in the context of what people call activism, right? This idea of the word activism, where activism has to be specialized from anything else, as a project. Anyways, I mean,
I mean, just kind of tying what you and Lara were saying, thinking about October 7th, right? Something Nitasha and I were so much about October 7th that's important, because it was a refusal. People focus on the violence. That was a refusal of a foreclosure of possibilities, and an affirmation of life more than anything, because their project is a project of death. We see it. The fact that it's not me right now means nothing. The fact that it's not me also needs to be put under consideration. The me, the I, on whose terms, who's recognized and who's not, who has value and who doesn't. This is some colonial bullshit, right? If people didn't like the violence, do something about it. All right, so that's just, But then October 7th was part of this refusal and building and getting free, and it's not a future project. It's not like a future thing that you arrive to. It's something that you enact, embody, right? And create. The we is constructed in struggle. What struggle looks like, it's all facets of life, because we need to reproduce everything that sustains our life together. The fact that we're focusing on an institution means that's one part of the whole thing. We can't engage in little things and not understand that our enemy is planetary. It makes no sense. That doesn't mean that you get overwhelmed by it. It actually means that wherever we are, we can strike at empire if we're oriented towards each other. Asada Shakur broken out of jail with a white dude. white dude broke Asada Shakur out of jail. Where we are, that you work at a museum doesn't mean you're a bad person. This isn't a project, this isn't around purity. We're all in it, right? But our orientation towards life, towards liberation, or towards assimilation. Those who assimilate, when they know it's a genocidal system, are profiting from people's death. That's what you mean by complicity now. Because if you're choosing your life over others, it's just because you didn't have to do a payment. But then we are people, I say we, but we're in construction. We're people that value life differently. My body, my life doesn't begin and end with my skin and where it is. We're entangled, we're connected. We breathe the same air, which brings me to Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs, because when they were talking about what time is it on the clock of the world, that's an everlasting question. And then what are you doing on the ground? It was after they came out of the riots of Detroit. And you know, Fanon talked about the riots as like, that's people breathing when they can't breathe. So the transformative spaces are spaces you recognize them because they help you breathe. And we learned also that when we breathe together, and that's our connection. It's not only a connection, frankly, it's unavoidable, you know? But this is important in terms of knowing and different ways of knowing, because in October 7th, Abu Ubaidah, and after, what did he say in one of his last speeches? We have shifted from Tufan al-Aqsa to Tufan al-Wa'i. This is about consciousness and awareness right now. Our acts can mean nothing or can mean everything. It's how we value them. But you can't expect your enemy to help you value things in a way that sustains your life when you see them killing you. People need to sit with that. There are consequences of choosing to assimilate right now. Now, I know it's hard, right? But there is no way out. The assimilation is very clear where that leads. And then there's, you know, it's not just the Palestinians. You look at South Lebanon, they're experiencing the genocide, the same doctrine Israel is doing. The US is doing it here. So then, okay, flip it. And let's say, going back to Decolonize This Place, 6 strands of struggle. This was important because that was the foundation for which you can both refuse and do. Find each other, the orientation is different. You still live in a city. We still see things, but we're different. And we're at a time right now in which in the United States, the idea of left and right is nonsense. There's a lot of reasons why that's nonsense. But it's funny because that was Occupy Wall Street, actually. People, we're, you know, this is how we talk. We know, we come from that tradition of left. We understand it. But you're talking about millions of people right now that are getting screwed, and they know it. That's the new part. They know it. And movements like those for life should have everyone engaged in some fashion, or at least have a reading of the landscape in which, when our actions do speak to this swaths of the population. If you look at Columbia, which is something that you got at Columbia University. Columbia University, we applied the 6 strands of struggle in a zine that we put out in 2021 called Globalize the Intifada. And it looked at Columbia as a case study. And it says, here's the 6 strands applied to Columbia around agent of gentrification, imperial elite getting the debts that they're putting, stolen land bequeathed by the queen, who's on their boards and so forth and so on, and what are they teaching? That was in 2021, and in 2023, the coalition that came around that, right, understood that. But then something, let's say, that I was surprised is, why would the Palestine liberation struggle be also an issue silo here in the United States, which we see is shifting now? But Palestine, when it brings us together, you have to ask where you are and what are the other struggles that are strategic and they're oriented towards life and liberation. And then you understand the acts that you're doing and the strategy that you're taking. Not one that's like, oh, well, now I had the mayor speak out for me, speak up for me. No, now the most marginalized who love Palestine because they see their struggle in it, find a home in New York City that can upend this bullshit. Because if you're in New York, you're in not just the imperial core, you know, that's even abstract. Everything here gets multiplied elsewhere. The Knicks game that was like a week ago, everyone in the world knew there was the Knicks in the finals. So if you're in New York, you also have an added responsibility geographically of knowing where you are.
Yeah, and the impact globally, basically, what you're saying. I mean, this is so important, again, to localize, but localize and then commute between the local and the global, because this is the whole point, right? And I love that you all, I want folks to hear this. In 2021, there was a Globalize the Intifada zine that took Columbia University as its example. So when we fast forward and see what those motherfuckers did to their students, that was already, the infrastructure was already there, which is also, by the way, I think part of what you all are saying. And again, what organizers like you all have set in motion over the last decade, particularly, is this reading of this. This is why the student intifada was so effective, because we immediately saw students not siloing off Palestine. The rousing call was Palestine. We know this. The genocide that was unfolding as a natural extension of settler colonialism and Zionist aggression in our region was the rallying call. But students, as they were getting brutalized, as their degrees were being taken from them, they were talking about capitalism, they were talking about racism, they were talking about labor, they were talking about who the fuck cares about our degrees and our elite, institutions if we live in a world that's being destroyed by the military industrial complex and we won't have a world to live in. I really think, part of what you're saying is like, it's because they were able to articulate the connections between the strands you all are talking about, that this shit had to be shut down.
Yeah.
And that continued. I mean, we just saw the FBI raid students in Michigan just like a couple weeks ago. There's still students being threatened with, whether it's deportation or legal or lawsuits. We see what they're doing in the UK, imprisoning people. We see the 70 plus years against people organizing against ICE. All of these sorts of things fit into what you all are saying. And this is the thing I think to keep coming back to, is this has a long history. We already know this. If we're reading capitalism, empire, settler colonialism all together, you kind of open up this space. And like you brought in Abu Abaida, which I love and always welcome on this show, is it's about reading it. And then it's about what are the ways we're constantly pushing up and renegotiating the consciousness that we need to move with the moment. Because the Gaza of Tawfan al-Aqsa is it's a different Gaza now. It's a different Lebanon now. It's a different New York now. It's a different settler colony and empire entirely now. Iran has changed the entire fucking world. Like that, I think that's part of it. And for me, rather than sort of fall into, wow, this is so big and I want to collapse with like the failures, is to see what if the orientation from the beginning, like you all are saying, was one that was already imbued with constant movement, with the fact that we're needing to be in constant movement, because what power does is consolidate and recalibrate and sort of cohere. I feel like that gives us a blueprint about like, all right, the counterforce to this, against this counterinsurgency, is we got to keep it moving. Like Nitasha, you were saying that, like movements keep moving.
Yeah, and I think like just going back to your point of like this is not new. I think we're also like, I think it's important to understand the movements for decolonization also that we've seen, in the past. Like I'm talking about 40s and 60s, especially in Asia and Africa, and also like, South America and North America. That decolonization is very different from what we've seen in Asia and Africa, right? And I think they both have something to learn from each other. Like, if we say like Abyoyala, is about like centering land, water, and air as like methods for decolonization and not just as a metaphor, as we were talking about. The thing that we've seen from Asia and Africa is that the nation state as a method for freedom doesn't really work, right? Which was like the rallying cry for a lot of movements that come from our part of the world, right? And so if we actually kind of start to think about combining the two, then we really come to this idea of the planetary, where land, water as central, and the commons, and this idea of like, private property, abolition, all of these things kind of come forward. So, like, I think like learning from history, this is why I think it becomes really important to understand that what decolonization means today, because what modernity has done has made us think that we are post-colonial, right? When actually we're not. There is nothing called as post-colonial, right? So that idea of like, oh, colonialism, post-colonial, we have post-colonial economies. Now we can, be part of the global system. I mean, most of our countries now are more interested in whether they're part of the G20 summit or what's happening here. How does like, I mean, even the Iran situation, right, is like, what's the new global power? Is it Iran, China, and Russia, or is it the US, Israel, and Europe, right? So there's all these, and people often say that now, oh, this is the World War III, which is all bullshit, right? In one sense, when you actually start thinking about it through the lens of Palestine, because what we're talking about here is like, well, actually, what we're talking about in terms of decolonization is no extraction of land, period. Like climate change is not separate from the conversation on Palestine, right? That we're actually at a very pivotal moment. So we have to understand that there's a lot of numbers that were played on us, especially in the creation of the nation state, right? Which then related to the subject formation. We've all really bought into this idea. And so what decolonization means today, or abolition for that matter, is very different from even when we started off in 2016, for example, right? And I think and even though we have a lot of differences, when we come from Black struggle or Palestine or, indigenous struggle or even from Asia, but we have to kind of see where the commonalities are. And this is the place where counterinsurgency attacks the most, because they don't want people to come together. They don't want these relationalities. And while they're all together, right, the whole world is buying Israeli military, right? Military technology. Everyone in the world buys from the Israeli military because they're the best in surveillance. They're the best in all of these things. So that's number one, right? I think we really need to figure out what we mean by decolonization and abolition today. It's not diversity, equity, inclusion, which all the universities sold us. And we've seen the disaster and the end of that, including these museums, right? Like, we have the best shows, which the most artists of color, or we now have a new professor of color. That hasn't led us anywhere at this point. So we have to really, I think, define, and it's important to not also lose those words because they mean something historically. So that's number one. And the second thing I think is, in relation to what Amin was also talking about, this idea of assimilation, but also is this idea of purity, right? This is something that Western liberal project has really sold us really well, is the idea of political movements is also around purity, right? There has to be political purity around who function, right? So then we have the cancel culture, we have all these things while we're actually not dealing with the problem at hand directly. So, there's this thing that we often talk about, this idea of the contradiction, right? So it could be that you are a university professor, but you still want to abolish the university. You are an artist, but you still want to abolish the museum, right? There isn't like, it's not about like, oh, now you take sides. I mean, of course, there is a line that needs to be drawn, and Palestine shows us that. But at the same time, we have to think about what those contradictions mean. And this is where, I started in the beginning. What are we giving our energy to, right? We don't even realize it, but just because what pays our rent, what pays the food bills, often ends up taking so much of our energy that we cannot imagine another way of being. And so what does autonomy actually mean? And not just autonomy as a buzzword or just an economic word or all of that, but actually in our bodies, collectively, food, medicine, all of it, right? How are we actually creating that space? And I mean, we can see some of it in, the Zapatistas have been working on it for a long time. There's other struggles that have been working around that. But that's where we are, right? So if we're thinking about New York City, we know what crisis it is on, right? Mental health, of course, health, food. I mean, it's a city that, you can only live there if you're in the capitalist system. Otherwise, you get pushed out or you go on the streets. So how are we actually creating infrastructure that also supports us, and is also something that doesn't assimilate back into that and also creates another option? So I would say that these are the two things that I feel like are really important right now, because this project is working on another speed, right? It's a whole other
Exactly.
trajectory. Yeah.
Darn, I was hoping you were going to say Mamdani was going to fix all of this for us.
You know what's crazy about Mamdani? It's like, we just need to talk to his father.
Anjad, I know.
شو هالتخلفة؟
يلا حبيبي يلا شبيك.
I think something, let's say, I think that our movements also have, in the US, as opposed to Palestine, the movements here are movements always that seem to want to correct the system and think if they just correct here, they've taken care of the thing. There's something counterintuitive about it. It's actually the only way you could change anything is if you have power. The only way you have power is with each other. It's not the same type of power. And then there's a war being waged on us. I mean, if you're not understanding that, then you're not really dealing with this moment kind of oriented towards, you don't want to be oriented towards war. But when there's a project of annihilation, you should kind of take that into consideration. And I think that as to how you move and how you organize, again, I can do a tabling outside and be thinking this way. Because the way information travels the most in the world still is one-on-one conversations. They have sold us a lot of bullshit. And it's really important to step out of that bullshit. And we use also reference James Baldwin. Like one of the technologies here that are at play is that similar to the enslaved on ships, they were tied with their backs to each other. And they were known to not speak the same language or come from the same territory. So they're this facing opposite on a ship being taken to enslavement because so they wouldn't talk to each other. They wouldn't understand what was happening to them. Because maybe if they did, the outcome would have been different because they would have known more of what was happening. These things right now, that's why you gather. That's why you listen to podcasts and then you try to take that information outside of a device now. They don't want us moving. I know New York City right now, it takes us an hour and a half to go by subway, anywhere. It's so not cared for. The police are always on the platform. Traffic is crazy. Gas is insane. So people don't move. People don't move. It's all about movement. They don't want people to move. They won't want people to move from one state to another, from one city to another, from one borough to another, from a rich neighborhood. They don't want to see you. So they're creating these spaces. And I think that just to connect it back to Palestine and to highlight the urgency, two things. One, to remember the first Palestinian uprising, Intifada, and how it tells us something about this moment in terms of the face of such odds. But the other one is the Isaac Accords. You have the Abrahamic Accords in the context of the Middle East, which is the Zionization of that entire region, creating a supremacist race and doing all that shit. But they're doing the same in this continent through Argentina. First, they burned down Patagonia, right, under the Isaac Accords. Millet goes to Israel, signs a contract to take 300,000 Zionists to Argentina to live under their same sovereignty, while Peter Thiel moves to Argentina. So within Argentina, outside of Argentina, Remember, Argentina was one of the places they were going to make another Palestine, take Palestine, right? So, and this history right now is being activated to destabilize entire regimes that are beneficial, like they did with the Palestinians, like they did with the Lebanese. So they're putting their puppets in their regimes, right? They're doing, and these data centers, they're also colonial territory being taken because they're taking people's resources south of the border in Mexico, aside from the concentration camps that they're creating. And they're taking this land and they're taking people's water and electricity and giving them 99-year leases. You know what land was given 99-year leases? Jordan land to Israel, right? Because they want to extract from the land. That's what they're doing. So these same conditions that we're seeing all the way over there are already over here. And the way, honestly, the way I feel in New York right now is some people want to be settlers here, want to enact these privileges. So there's a settler class emerging, right? So if you're fighting, I mean, just think about it. It's not that people should vote or not vote. That's such a stupid conversation to have. Ammi, vote, tuhil anni. Vote, run, do it. I don't care. But what people are saying is that you're wrong. Everyone should be doing the thing that you're doing when you don't have the same skin in the game. And you don't see the world the way I do. And I think that's important. Why? Because bringing it back to Decolonize This Place, and then I'll go to Palestine of First Intifada. When we did our organizing against the Whitney Museum, there was a biennial like there is right now. That biennial was known for the first time to be the most progressive biennial. It had queer, trans, indigenous, Black, under a certain age. I think the curators were people of color. When it came time, they're making art about Black death. They're making art about stolen land. They're making art and showing it at the Whitney. The Whitney who is involved in the genocide through who's on the board. So then you go, and not that you called for a boycott of the Whitney. You didn't do that. You went and you talked to the artists and you're like, listen, this is going on. See how you strike against the institution. But the artists were so invested in their identity of oppression to produce art, to have it be recognized by the institution, that they said, this is our Obama moment, and didn't participate. Right? Those people are not on the same side. Back then, I'm talking about, let's say, friends. This is not talking shit about anyone. We're talking about friends and family now. This is not an outside thing. So you don't do anything, but then you also take the side of the oppressor and attack. Therefore, allowing them to weaponize identities. Because it's like, oh, look, this is anti-Blackness. Oh, look, they don't recognize. Oh, look, they are privileged. That's the language of counterinsurgency and policing, and we do it to each other, and people should not do that because it's not generous. You don't like something, do something else. No one imposes anything on anyone, but that's across the board. So then you say, okay, as responsible people in a movement with difference, what did we learn from that? We learned that we needed to do Strike MoMA because we needed not to go into the institution this time. We needed to deoccupy space across from it. We need to disrupt it. And we needed to put a manifesto called Strike MoMA Framework for Terms of Struggle to address the issue around what is art. Oh, I love the institution so much. I can't live without knowing MoMA exists. Or, any of these things. And say, well, at least at least we've done what we can to say art and museums are two different things. There's a long history of art that rejects the institution, that's oriented towards liberation. It comes from all these different struggles and strands. Now's the time to strike. And strike is a verb, but it means many things. It could be a boycott. It could be an alternative gathering. It could be anything that decenters and destabilizes and unsettles the institution, because that institution is Rockefeller money on stolen land, oppressing its workers, creating aesthetics that normalizes settler colonization across the continent, extraction, CIA, all of these things. MoMA determines what aesthetics is around the world, because why would people in Palestine all want to be painters if there wasn't a market to sell your painting? Who makes the market? The people that sit on MoMA. And that's the same time we did that zine, because خلاص خبرناكم. We're clear. It's important that you don't hide behind there's only one world and this is how it looks. If you think this is the only world possible, you're on a different path. But we're working for the world right now, during genocide. The answer to the fact that Palestine, the genocide's still going on, is we need to remake the world in which many worlds fit for Palestine to be free. If you think that's unreasonable, if you think that's irrational, if you think those demands are illogical, tamam. That's your path. But we're creating something different. That difference is important. That difference I learned when I was a teenager growing up in Palestine, because remember, the first Palestinian uprising that began in '87 was against settler colonization, occupation, and a state. All three, right? The horizon was liberation and freedom. The horizon didn't identify our own state. That wasn't how a bunch of factions, 22 factions to create the popular committees came together. They actually put aside basic differences around ideology and focused on liberation and the rejection of the state and creating sustainable practices. In opposition, these sustainable practices are political if they're oriented as such and part of a network and node. That was Beit Jala, Beit Sahur. They had their own cows. You watched a movie about it. But what was super important is that they came in that moment that was critical. Organizers came together and had conversations from different backgrounds, but they were united on the liberation and in opposition to settler colonization, occupation, and the state in that context. And then the popular uprising grew from that. And it had economic dimension, an educational dimension, a political dimension, a health dimension, all aspects of life. It should be happening now. Every church should have opened for ICE. It should have opened for Palestine. They didn't. Movements should remember. Because we don't come and go, we're here. And you're learning. And then you need to go back and you need to know which church. Are you still going to keep your doors closed? It's harder for a church to keep its door closed when there's several struggles versus one. You can create practices there. Those practices of economy are important to keep people not joining cops. Because what did they do after the pandemic? They made people poor because they were worried about recruitment. Now they're figuring out how to capitalize from people being poor on the stock exchange, which shouldn't be surprising because the New York Stock Exchange, its first stock was enslaved people. I mean, the walls of Wall Street were to keep enslaved people in. So we're going on that path. The fact that people keep going from one struggle to another is wild to me. When in fact, liberation requires all of us. We've said it, but we haven't enacted it.
Yeah, well, it's harder to hold on to because we can look at all these things and track them, and even look at Ghazi, which is precisely what you're saying, like what happened in the first Intifada. It's the same thing, the coalitions coming together and saying, here's our common fucking enemy. Like I always joke to people, if Hamas and PFLP can come together and do the shit they're doing, like no one should be fighting. Literally no one should be fighting. We all know who our common enemy is. But that's, I think, part of the point is how do they capture us in certain ways? And one of the things I think that you're articulating is how strong identifications are. And that's the thing that I would like people to sort of consider and interrogate and antagonize within ourselves is our, and this is, I think, Nitasha, you said, where do you put your energies, is a similar version of this. I think that our affective investments in what and who, right? We're like, who are you defending? Who are you stabilizing? When you side with the Whitney Museum or an identity that, by the way, has been created by white supremacy, like you need to come around your identity in this particular way because white supremacy creates a world of racial hierarchy and then lures you into that. And you think that occupying that position is going to fix something when really it's just shoring that back up. But I think these are that we identify with organizations, we identify with particular class positions, we identify with identities of national identities. I had Abdul Jawad Omar on the show last week, and he was talking about even, you know, he and I both, and I think all of us agree about like that we're against all the borders that separate us in our region, that we don't agree with the nation state of Lebanon by itself, Palestine by itself, all these sorts of things. Six Pico, go fuck yourself. Like this is the point. We're all a common people. But he was saying about how it's a date we need to keep paying attention the ways you all are saying about how nationalist discourse then even rallies people along those ways, right? But that's, I think, part of what I'm saying is like, of course you want to defend the sovereignty of Lebanon, and also it can't just stop there because then you get pulled into these identifications that we're talking about that don't just, the point is not just to pull you in. The point is to derail, defang, and domesticate your energies that could go elsewhere, because the identification with that formation then becomes far more important than anything else that could emerge, right? Which is, again, what I hear you all saying in this. I want to hear, Nitasha, if you have any thoughts. Somebody in the chat asked about the 6 strands again. If you want to just say for folk, there are more folks than there were when you had initially said them. And then I thought I saw you go towards unmuting, so I want to open up space for you also to say something.
Yeah, the 6 strands of struggle are first was indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation, free Palestine, global wage workers, which actually kind of, you know, talks about no borders, right? That who's actually doing the production work for where to survive, right? So that's number 4. Degentrification, and it was also connecting it to stolen land, right? That gentrification is not different from stolen land. And the 6th one was dismantling patriarchy. So those were the kind of 6 strands of struggle. I mean, I think like just going off of what you were saying, I mean, I think the other thing that, you know, what counterinsurgency does is also exhaust you continuously, because you feel like you're stuck in a loop, right? Because they're really, like, I mean, if you think about it, there isn't really any, like, you know, there isn't really any way to hold memory of what has actually happened in terms of organizing spaces. Like when we're, you know, right now, when you keep reiterating what Decolonize This Place did in 2016 or what is there, I mean, it also feels very similar to when you know, the Tahrir Square movement happened, and people were like, oh, it's like a social media movement, and people organized on Twitter, and that's how that happened. But actually, the reality is something very different, right? There was actually years of organizing and that brought people together. And then now we're also seeing what that current moment is. Like Egypt is one of the most fascist places in the region, right? With people still in prison, and barely, I mean, most of it is military control, and it's a huge part of what's going on in Gaza, right? So in order to be able to leave Gaza, you almost have to pay more than like 5,000 US dollars, which at some point became 10,000 US dollars to be able to leave Gaza, which was, you know, going, of course, to militias in Egypt and, of course, Israel too. So, you know, this is like, when, you know, this is a reality. And I think, you know, this idea of like, this is why I was also saying, like, where do we put our energy? We have to be very precise, because this system's method is to exhaust you, is to disorient you, and is for you to know that there isn't a purpose, right? If you don't buy into the idea that, you need a job that gives you a house and a car that you actually go into debt to buy, or you have that your only way of
It's
being
good
is
debt, though.
it's good debt.
That's
Or if you have
considered good debt.
exactly, or you have some sort of family structure, right? You can't be single without kids, right? Like, how can you actually think about, like, this kind of, like, very heteronormative kind of reality? It really has you sold. It's increasingly becoming more difficult to be something else. So this idea of identifying to what, right? And then you have the liberal project, which is then trying to say, well, you can be queer, and you can be a single woman, and you can be all of these things, and this is our agenda, right? But we're still going to have a nation state, and we're going to still put people outside of that. And so I think in that way, I think it really becomes important to identify what a project is and where really do we invest our time. And so in that way, I would say that even at this point, it doesn't matter whether it's a nation state, right? Or what, really, it's really about territories. Your neighborhood is a territory, right? The place that you're engaged in. Do you actually have really meaningful relationships with people that you're working with? It could be literally like a small patch of land. It doesn't have to be this really big project that you're doing. But what is it that you're making right now that can get you out of the system, like de-assimilate from it, right? And again, like, I'll bring in the idea of the contradiction, because it's not like, that you end up becoming a threat. It's important for your livelihood. You can be, part of the system, and of course it's double the work, but that's the only option at this point, is to slowly peel off, slowly create other systems of, sustenance. And I mean, we know this from many, like, even refugee camps in Palestine. They've been doing this for a long time. They don't have an option, right, except for being together. I mean, maybe you can talk more about the idea of popular committees that are actually set up. Like, there's a history in Palestine around popular committees, and those popular committees, people were responsible for health, for education, for food, these basic kind of things. For consciousness building, we have the San Kanafani, right? He was actually part of PLP, and his whole project was to actually, learn from the movement and write about it, right? And so I think we're this is why I keep saying that where are we right now? Like, what time is it? And in this time, for me, it's not enough, like, okay, that, when we're, as Amin said, when we're talking about Palestine, we're then talking about everywhere. Because in order to free Palestine right now, we need to free ourselves wherever we are, right? It's not just about this thing elsewhere. It's about where we are and how we can change that reality.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking that also, like, I want to talk about borders and states just as like a thing. Like, that's how the world's organized. It's organized based on nation states, which are contradictory projects, really. That's how they manage. But let's say the state. The state exists ever since modernity did. It's the flip side of colonialism. So when you talk about the state as a project, a set of values, patriotism is like, where do you get value from? You're an American citizen. We just had 4th of July. Like, if you're into that mode of a project, a horizon of freedom, that's like, you're fighting colonialism within it. It's not that states don't matter. States matters and borders especially matters for those who don't have them, because we live in this kind of world. And at the same time, we need to understand what is the state in relation to the project that we're pursuing. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, where they talked about decolonization as synonymous with nation states, freedom is synonymous with nation states, was bullshit. That's how they restructured the thing. So Palestine was an open wound. They're still trying to close it, so that question doesn't even emerge. But it's emerging in Palestine, and Palestine actually insisted that freedom be the ultimate thing and not what a state or a nation state looks like, because that is just a bundle of rights that the powerful give you. So, you know, I think like that's one thing. The other thing is like, the reason the strands are important is also because when a lot of people come together, they were part of oppressions enacted against each other, and they profit certain privileges under oppression, then you carry with you. To struggle together and not recognize that is a problem. Movements become the societies that we are imagining. So you enact them now. So then the strands were about how do we recognize the debts we owe each other. These debts, they're not meant to be repaid. They're the social fabric of the worlds we're creating. People need to value that as well. So that was another thing that came to mind. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, you know, talk about neighborhood as a practice, you know, and I think that's also true. People get stuck in thoughts and ideas in a language that's dead. And then they stick with their phones and their screens, and they're being fed a whole framing of the world. And framing of the world, not the way we understand it, but the way we sense it, right? The way we sense the world and make sense of it. So I think that valuing what we do and valuing is really key. And I think, you know, just to kind of thought about like right now, like I think people may look at the Palestinian uprising in the 80s to the 90s in a different way, but we do it all the time. Like it looks old. The encampments did the same thing. We reproduce the life. We're there for each other. All of a sudden, food tastes good. You didn't have money, but there's food. This is liberation. It's not, oh, there's a movement or a moment and it's gone. It's telling us about what we need to be doing. The trick that they play on us is they keep us engaged with them so that it shapes our horizon. And when we don't, they use violence.
Yeah,
and
they're the reference point forever.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And violence creates the violence that they enact on us, let's say the genocide, and not just the person whose limbs have been torn or the person that have been starved to death, but even the people here that struggled watching it and witnessing it and bearing witness. It's really shaping us. So inaction is a form of becoming in the image the way they want. And then you're beholden in your thoughts because the violence is creating lopsided structures of the imagination. So we're alone, we're lonely, we're alienated, and then we're thinking to ourselves how to solve the problem by ourselves. But then our mind isn't helping us because we've been smacked with all these images and you just want it to stop. And you don't know why it won't stop. But the way it stops and why it won't stop is because the same way you're feeling bad about your life are the behind causes of why the genocide is happening to begin with. The hierarchy of oppression, the Olympics oppression, that's in their world of assimilation. In the world that we're fighting for, there's abundance. I throw down for Palestine, not because I have to choose which hours to put here or here. I fight for Palestine because my existence depends on it. The world that I imagine could be, the way I want my children to grow, the way I don't want animals to be harmed. Those are what we're fighting for. That shouldn't be negotiable, right? It's just not, it just shouldn't. You know,
right.
And I think there's a lot of history here that really should help people understand. In South and North Dakota, in the Dakotas, in the against the pipeline, in the history, you know, there's a beautiful poem by Layli Long Soldier called 38. And you could get it on SoundCloud and just listen to her rendition. What's happening to Palestine has already happened step by step to indigenous people. including when they rose up because they were being starved, because they took their land and they didn't have money, and the seller was a settler and wouldn't give debt. And then they rose up, and the first person they killed was the settler who wouldn't give them food and stuffed his mouth with grass. That was her poem. So that was her poem to write about what she thought was a poem. The poem was the act, right? And I think that they make us devalue our actions. But you have to understand, everything we're talking about are abstractions that are constructed by consent. We consent to the system. When you go to the DMV, when you go to this place or to that place, you're saying, yes, state, da-da-da-da-da. Doesn't mean that you don't need a license. It just means that you need to know that. That's the important part. And then you need to have that place may seem, again, this idea of foreclosure, but honestly, it creates knowing that your consent matters. And it's how this whole thing continues, creates both agency and responsibility. We are powerful, right? But it's not a power, it's like, oh, it's an identity. It's a practice of coming together, of being able to say no, of creating infrastructure that supports us. I can be of a certain class, but my allegiance is to liberation. So I'll betray the class that I'm from for that. That's really important. And Palestine becomes central because it brings us together, and it brings all these struggles together, and it's geostrategic planetarily to have the type of conversation, because we're in a place where it's people against states. It's people against corporations. It's people against media things. But we're so many more than them.
Exactly. We're the global majority, folks. We're the global majority. I mean, this is so important, and part of, why I am, constantly coming back to psychic militancy, because the point is to cohere around like these strands, or sort of repeating them, is also because the attempts of power to steer us away from it and to make us believe in the lie of fixedness, of foreclosure, having these strands there and reconnecting to them and renegotiating our relationships to them are also part of the way in which we make known and expose precisely the machinery and the logics of power that are going to work in those ways. They will work through patriarchy. They will work through colonialism and settler colonialism. They will work through gentrification. They will work through these. So for us to be like, this is our constant struggle, is to always be determining what my position is in relationship to these structures, what possibilities are there, and my allegiances to whom, right? All the way, because they're going to seduce us. They seduce us through just like, hey, this is a good thing, or they seduce us through making you poor and miserable, right? But they're coercive relational structures in the end. I had and we can sort of start to wrap up at this, because I want folks to know about this course you all are teaching. But I did an interview with Nick Estes, our comrade and Indigenous scholar, on the show. It's a long form interview. And one of the most moving parts, the whole conversation was very moving for me. But one of the most moving parts that he said ties into what you all are talking about, both in terms of where we put our energies and also continuing to feed the vitality of our imagination about what's possible, is he said one of the things that colonialism feeds us or shoves down our throat is that the best days, he was talking about his tribe particularly, the best days are far gone, that we're never allowed to imagine that the best days are yet to come.
Yeah.
That is never a possibility that's provided to people. And like that stopped me in my tracks, because I want folks to see, like, that sounds like such a simple statement, but think about all the ways and all the infrastructure, back to our entire conversation, all the pieces that have to work together to make it such that folks cannot think, are not allowed to think, or are drawn into or conscripted into believing that nothing better for their people could be possible. Right? That's, I mean, that just stopped me. And that's why I keep coming back to it. But that is why us being militant, having these conversations, saying that the things that you all have been working on tirelessly for more than a decade, it continues to move through us and respond to the moment. But the logics of power don't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And our responses and why we respond, it's also centering to be like, we continue to struggle for a world that is about life and life making, not succumb to the prescription of death that they constantly give us, you know? So I'm going to have that as our segue into the amazing course you all are teaching. And then I want to hear if you have anything left to say. So if you all enjoyed this conversation as much as I do, I feel so full and vibrating around this for the reasons that we've all seen. Amin and Nitasha are teaching a course, and that course is Grief Resistance and the Future of Being Human. It'll be from Sundays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, July 26th to September 27th. If you all are interested in taking that course with Nitasha and Amin, I'm going to post it in the chat for you all. You can hit up Amar Hussain, who's wonderful. Shout out to Amar, a comrade at heart and a fellow clinician. And there's you can see the link there where you can set up a consultation. That's Amar's IG handle. So you can tap into that. I wish I could take this course for all the reasons. I thankfully have access to these folks outside of it, so I'm going to take advantage of that. But I will tell you all, think about taking this course, ground with these folks. This is just a snippet. And I feel like a lot of what you're saying is, again, what you both have been saying is, how do we commit to the act of making something anew, ourselves, transform the world, and believe. That's the certainty. Like, we don't need to know what it looks like, but to be certain that that's possible. Be certain that that is our focus, that needs to be our focus. I'm going to give you both the last word. Anything else you'd leave folks with, where they can find you? I put it in the show notes on Twitter. I refuse to call it a new name, Decolonize this place. So, but anything else you want to leave folks with?
I'll just go first, so then you can finish. I think because we were talking about the foreclosure part, I just want to the things that I've been focusing on in the last few years is that the foreclosure is not just on our consciousness, but it's also on our body. Like, we don't see the possibilities within our body. And like, especially, since the genocide and in relation to what all we've seen, I think they want us to make sure that there is no idea of possibility, because that's what's going to happen to you. Right. So that level of fear and that level of like foreclosure has become very, very internalized. It's in our limbs, it's in our structure. So I think that the project that I think we're talking about, it's a project of reorientation from every aspect possible, and the body is a huge part of it. How do we actually feel the possibility in our own body at this point? Because it's been completely programmed for this project. So that was the one thing that I just wanted to add, that it's really insane. Like, you actually, it's really something that has a grip. We have this idea of colonial matrix of power, and we know how that functions in these kind of different ways. And I think the body is a huge part of it also. So I think in order for us to think about possibility, we also have to think about possibilities within ourselves, right? With our bodies and with our consciousness, and to not separate them in some ways. Amin?
Yeah, I think issue silos should not continue. That makes no sense. Valuing life and death must happen. Because if you think about where resistance is possible, it's where people have a different understanding of the world and how to make sense of it. So you have the Palestinian resistance, you have the resistance in Lebanon, you have the resistance in Yemen, You have the resistance in Iraq. You have Iran, right? Which is a resistance in a way in the form of a state, right? So all of those situations, they make meaning, and they value things, and they value life and death differently, so they're able to resist. And that comes from the Islamic tradition for them, for us. Where you get your cosmologies, how do you make sense of the meaning, consciousness, these things? This is what's at stake. And so when we're fighting them, we have to fight for a world in which many worlds can fit. And if you're not doing that in your neighborhood, around the area where you're living, thinking from where you are, it's always going to be foreign, it's always going to be removed. But trust, everyone is doing that right now. You're not alone. That's the other thing. So being outside, taking action, creates the possibility of what Nitasha is talking about. Organizing isn't about getting something done. Organizing is how do you come together. All of those ways are possible, and the intergenerational is really important. Look, I was in Palestine growing up in the first uprising, got shot when I was young, all these things. What's really important about that experience is that I did it because I wanted to live. You just have to love life that much right now,
What a beautiful way to end. You gotta love life that much and pour everything into it, And I think there is a different configuration to life and death and what it means to sacrifice to be able to live, and the world to live, and the people that come after us to live, not live. Back to what you were saying, not just about us alone, individually. Thank you both so much. I love you. I appreciate you. I learn so much from you every single time we get to do this, which has been way too long, folks, way too long. So next time is not going to be this long. For folks watching, I dropped the information for the course that Amin and Nitasha are teaching. I will put that in the show notes as well, so for folks who come in afterwards, you can touch base about that. But thank you both so much. And folks, I'll see you all on Saturday. We have another live stream. Everybody still loves Nora, so there'll be an announcement soon. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you.
Bye. Thank you for having us.
Of course.